Afaq was a mechanic. Maha was a journalist. Riaz was a cop. Shehryar was a king in the shadows, when one of them ended up brutally murdered, burned, broken, and unrecognizable. It triggered a chain of events that would expose decades of secrets, corruption, and betrayal. What began as a single, horrifying crime turned into a reckoning no one saw coming. In the dusty suburbs of Karachi, away from the city's chaos and high rises, stood a small garage on a quiet street lined with crumbling walls and faded shop signs. This garage, with its rusty signboard and oil-stained floor, was the workplace of a man who never spoke more than necessary and never stayed longer than required. His name was Afaq. To the neighborhood, Afaq was just a regular mechanic. Skin darkened from sun and grease, hands always blackened with engine oil, and eyes that rarely met anyone else's. He worked with focus, precision, and silence. Customers liked him because he didn't overcharge, didn't talk unnecessarily, and always delivered on time. His life appeared predictable, but under the surface, it was anything but ordinary. Afaq's past was a shadow that followed him everywhere, though no one around him knew it. 10 years earlier, he had been deeply involved in a gang that operated out of the city's industrial area. Back then, he wasn't a mechanic. He was the gang's enforcer, known for his cold efficiency. He had a brother, Amir, younger by 2 years, who he loved more than anyone else in the world. They had joined the gang together, pulled in by poverty and desperation, lured by the promise of money, protection, and belonging. But when a gang deal went wrong, and someone needed to take the fall, Amir refused. The price of that refusal was paid with his life. Amir's body had been found in a warehouse, bound, beaten, and burned. No arrests were made. The police quietly closed the case, and everyone moved on. Everyone except Afaq. He disappeared after the funeral. Rumors said he had fled to the mountains, or even left the country. But the truth was more calculated. Afaq had cut all ties, changed cities, and rebuilt himself piece by piece, choosing anonymity over revenge. Or so it seemed. Years passed. Afaq built a new life in the shadows. Low profile, no close relationships, no attention. He buried the past so deep that even he began to believe he had moved on. Until a cold morning in December, when a local farmer noticed thick black smoke rising from a remote patch of road outside the city. The fire was coming from a car. It had crashed into a tree and burst into flames. By the time firefighters arrived, the fire had nearly reduced the vehicle to ashes. Inside, they found a body, charred beyond recognition, slumped in the driver's seat. No identification, no phone, no wallet. Just melted plastic and blackened bone. Investigators began their work, but progress was slow. The only thing not fully destroyed in the fire was a metal ring found under the seat. It was old, with the letters SK engraved on its surface. The initials didn't mean much at first, but when the ring's image was leaked and appeared on a small news report, it caught the attention of someone who hadn't heard that name in a long time. Maha was a young crime journalist working for a local digital outlet. She had covered dozens of murder cases, mostly petty crime, domestic disputes, and drug-related killings. But something about this case drew her in. She recognized the ring instantly. She had seen it once at a charity event, on the hand of a man who terrified her just by standing still. His name was Shehryar Khan. Maha didn't need to think twice. She called her editor, told him she had a lead, and began digging into recent sightings of Shehryar. When she realized he hadn't made any public appearance for the last 3 days, a cold certainty took over. The body in the car wasn't just anyone. It was someone who had spent years hiding in plain sight, someone powerful, dangerous, and feared. What she didn't know, however, was that this wasn't just a murder. It was a message, one that would shake the city's darkest corners and bring long-buried secrets back to the surface. And in the center of it all stood a quiet mechanic who no one really knew. News of the burned car and the possibility that it contained the body of Shehryar Khan spread like wildfire. Social media platforms buzzed with speculation, while television screens across the country replayed the same grainy footage of the fire, zooming in on the scorched metal and police tape fluttering in the wind. Most people couldn't believe it. Shehryar Khan, the untouchable tycoon, dead in such a brutal, humiliating manner. It seemed too unreal to be true. Shehryar Khan was a name that carried weight. To the public, he was a businessman, a philanthropist, the face behind several popular construction projects and youth employment campaigns. His image was one of success, generosity, and patriotism. But behind closed doors, he was a puppeteer who controlled a criminal empire so large that even law enforcement treated carefully around him. He had ties to drug trafficking, arms deals, land grabbing, and alleged contract killings, though nothing was ever proven. Witnesses disappeared. Cases collapsed. He had friends in the highest places and enemies who never lasted long. When DNA tests confirmed the remains were indeed Shehryar's, a strange silence settled over the authorities. What followed wasn't a typical investigation, but a storm of confusion, secrecy, and suppressed panic. The sheer brutality of the murder was unlike anything the officers had seen. His body hadn't just been burned. It had been tortured. Forensic reports revealed broken bones, shattered teeth, deep cuts across the torso, and signs of being tied and beaten for hours before the fire. One investigator later told a reporter, off the record, that even hardened professionals had to step out of the room during the examination. The police department scrambled to contain the fallout. Questions were being asked, and the media demanded answers. Pressure came from above. Ministers, senior bureaucrats, even business leaders wanted to know who had the audacity to murder Shehryar and leave him like that. The case couldn't be handled like any other. It needed a lead investigator with experience, someone trusted to keep things under wraps if necessary. That man was Inspector Riaz. Riaz had served in the force for over 25 years. He had built his reputation solving complex cases, but his hands were far from clean. He had worked the streets, but he also worked in the shadows, taking orders from men like Shehryar and ensuring their interests stayed protected. He knew how things worked. He knew when to push and when to pretend not to see. Assigning him the case was a message in itself. Find out who did this, but don't dig too deep. Riaz visited the scene personally. He studied the burnt vehicle, read the forensics report, and reviewed the initial evidence. He didn't say much, but inside, he was deeply unsettled. He had known Shehryar for years. The man had power, wealth, and security. If someone had gotten close enough to torture and kill him, it meant that this wasn't a random act. This was personal, and if someone had dared to go this far, they wouldn't stop with just one death. He ordered his team to start with the basics: trace phone records, study traffic cameras, question known rivals. But it didn't take long before a strange clue surfaced. One grainy security camera near a roadside stall showed Shehryar's car late at night, just hours before his death. The vehicle had driven down a narrow alley near a familiar location, an auto repair shop on the edge of town. The name on the board was simply Afaq Auto Services. The image was blurry, but it was clear enough for Riaz. Afaq. The name rang a bell. He dug into old records and pulled up a file long buried in the archives. It showed a younger Afaq. Thinner, harder eyes, arrested in connection with a gang that once worked with Shehryar's network. But after his brother's death, Afaq had vanished from all databases. Riaz frowned. This wasn't just a lead. This was a connection that went far deeper than the others suspected. He lit a cigarette, closed the file, and stared out of his office window. Someone had finally decided to challenge the empire. Inspector Riaz sat in his office, eyes fixed on the faded photograph of Afaq from over a decade ago. The man in the picture had the same sharp jawline, the same quiet fury in his eyes. It wasn't proof, but it was enough to tighten the noose. Still, Riaz was no fool. He knew how the game worked. He needed more than a photo and a coincidence. He needed something that tied Afaq directly to the murder scene, or better yet, to Shehryar himself. He ordered a discreet background check on Afaq's current life. Surveillance teams were sent to observe his movements. They found that Afaq lived alone in a small rented room behind his workshop, rarely spoke to neighbors, and kept no close friends. He didn't even own a smartphone. Everything about him screamed distance and caution. There was something unsettling about how clean his life looked. Too clean, too careful. For someone with a past like Afaq's, this much silence was dangerous. Meanwhile, Maha had been doing her own research. She had always been an outsider in the journalism world. Too direct, too intense, and unwilling to water down stories for the sake of sponsors. But this time, she wasn't chasing headlines. This time, it was personal. She knew Afaq from their teenage years. Back when they used to sit on rooftop ledges and talk about escaping the city's madness. He had vanished after his brother Amir's murder, and no one ever heard from him again. But when she saw the initials on that burned ring, SK, something clicked. She began digging into Amir's death and the gang they were both involved in. It didn't take long before she hit on something chilling. An old source, a former gang courier who had since turned informant, agreed to meet her in a dimly lit cafe. He confirmed what had long been whispered, but never proving Amir didn't die in a gang war or a robbery. He was tortured and killed on direct orders from Shehryar. The reason? Amir refused to take the blame for a murder that Shehryar had committed during a drug deal gone wrong. The gang needed a scapegoat. Amir refused. So, they made an example of him. Maha sat in silence as the truth settled around her like smoke. Afaq hadn't disappeared to escape danger. He had disappeared to plan. The next morning, she published an article titled, "The Skeleton Behind the Ring," without naming Afaq, but strongly hinting at a connection between Shehryar's murder and a forgotten death from 10 years ago. The piece exploded across news platforms. Within hours, the story had taken over the national discourse. Riaz was furious. The investigation had been quietly progressing, and now it was a spectacle. But the article did something else too. It forced Afaq into the spotlight. For the first time, reporters gathered near his garage. Customers hesitated to stop by. Neighbors began whispering. But Afaq didn't hide. He opened his workshop like any other day, worked on cars in silence, and locked up at sunset. His expression never changed, but his eyes now held something harder, like a man who had waited a long time for the storm to come. Riaz, sensing the pressure mounting, decided to act. He sent 2 plainclothes officers to bring Afaq in for questioning. But when they arrived at the garage, Afaq was already waiting. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. He calmly removed his apron, wiped his hands, and walked out with them man going to a long-delayed appointment. Inside the interrogation room, Riaz stared at Afaq, trying to read him. But there was no anger, no fear, no remorse, just silence. A silence so heavy it seemed to fill the room. Riaz asked the first question, expecting hesitation. But Afaq responded with a single sentence that changed the course of the entire casing. "I didn't kill him for revenge. I killed him because he kept breathing." And just like that, the story of a brutal murder became something else entirely. It became a reckoning. The confession left the room in a stunned silence. Inspector Riaz stared at Afaq, unsure whether he had just heard a murderer's arrogance or a man who had waited years to speak the truth. But even with that chilling sentence, Afaq offered no details, no description of the murder, no names of accomplices, no emotion, just the confirmation that he had done what everyone was afraid to even think about. He had ended Shehryar Khan. Riaz wanted to break him, wanted to shake the details out. But the more he pressed, the calmer Afaq became. As if he had already accepted whatever was coming. The case was no longer a mystery. It had turned into a courtroom spectacle waiting to happen. But then Afaq did something no one expected. He handed Riaz a small black bag. Inside were 3 items: a notebook wrapped in cloth, a USB drive, and a single envelope addressed simply with the word "Truth." Riaz opened the notebook first. It was filled with Shehryar's handwriting. Page after page of names, dates, accounts, locations. Every page was a confession in code. Names of politicians, police officials, judges, and business partners. People who had received bribes, given protection, or ordered hits. The USB held hours of audio recordings. Conversations between Shehryar and his clients where they casually discussed blackmail, murders, and money laundering as if talking about the weather. And the envelope. Inside was a photograph. It showed Shehryar, 10 years younger, standing over a bloodied and broken Amir, Afaq's younger brother. His expression was blank. No regret, no fear. Riaz sat back, stunned. This wasn't just a personal vendetta. This was an execution planned with surgical precision, and the evidence was enough to collapse an empire. But that also meant trouble. Big trouble. If this information got out, it would burn not just Shehryar's name, but half the city's powerful class with him. And Riaz knew his own name was mentioned, more than once. He had a choice to make. Bury the evidence and make the problem disappear. Or let the truth take its course and destroy everything he had spent his life protecting. He chose survival. That night, Riaz contacted 2 men he trusted, old colleagues who had worked dirty jobs before. The plan was to destroy the USB, replace the notebook with a forged one, and keep the photograph hidden. Afaq would be charged with murder. The motive would remain unknown. and life would go back to normal. But Riaz underestimated one person, Maha. While Riaz worked to bury the truth, Maha had been digging in silence. Someone from within the department had sent her a tip: check the evidence logs. Something's missing. When she visited the station under the guise of a follow-up interview, she managed to take a photo of the evidence ledger. Line 7 USB missing. Line 90 notebook substituted. She cross-referenced the handwriting in the official notebook and compared it to earlier samples of Shehryar's writing from archived property deals. They didn't match. Maha published her second article, A Murder, a Lie, and a Bag Full of Truths. It was more explosive than the first. This time, she named names, politicians, officers, and businessmen, all referenced with specific connections. She didn't accuse them directly, but the implications were clear. The media storm was immediate. Protesters gathered outside police stations. News channels ran segments all day. The department was forced to launch an internal review. And Inspector Riaz was placed under temporary suspension. But even then, he believed he could fix everything. He believed Afaq would remain behind bars, the media would lose interest, and in time, the city would forget. But what Riaz didn't know was that Afaq hadn't planned just a murder. He had planned a collapse. And the final move was yet to come. Weeks passed since Afaq's arrest, but the city hadn't moved on. Every newspaper, every channel, every conversation somehow led back to the brutal killing of Shehryar Khan and the secrets it unearthed. What had begun as the most disturbing murder of the year had now become a symbol of everything wrong with the system. Corruption, power, silence, and revenge. Inside the prison, Afaq remained calm. He didn't request a lawyer, didn't speak to the media, and didn't respond to public outcry. He spent his days in silence, reading old books from the prison library and observing everything around him with the same quiet intensity he had always carried. The guards didn't fear him, but they didn't feel comfortable around him either. There was something in his presence, an aura of a man who had nothing left to lose, yet everything still under control. Outside, the damage was spreading. Maha's reports had triggered multiple investigations. Several prominent businessmen were called in for questioning. A few junior officers were suspended. Inspector Riaz, however, remained untouched, at least publicly. But behind the scenes, his position was weakening. He was summoned to internal hearings and interrogated about missing evidence. Even his old allies had started distancing themselves from him. The walls were closing in. Then came the verdict. Afaq was found guilty of premeditated murder and sentenced to life in prison. The courtroom was packed, and Maha sat in the front row. Afaq showed no emotion when the sentence was read. He didn't flinch, didn't blink. It was as though he had expected it all along. The crowd outside the courthouse was divided. Some called him a killer. Others called him a hero. But the story didn't end there. Exactly 1 month after Afaq was sentenced, another body was found, this time in a quiet farmhouse just outside the city. It was badly burned, just like Shehryar's. But the investigators knew this wasn't a coincidence. The body was later identified as none other than Inspector Riaz. The manner of death was disturbingly similar: tortured, beaten, set ablaze, and in the ashes just like before, a ring was found. This time, it was Riaz. A thick silver band with his initials engraved on the inside. The message was clear. This was no random killing. Someone had made a statement. Again. What made the case even stranger was Afaq's airtight alibi. He had been in his cell the entire time, under constant surveillance. CCTV footage, guard statements, and log entries all confirmed it. He couldn't have left. There was no possible way he could have committed the murder. And yet, the murder bore his signature. Investigators were left with more questions than answers. Was Afaq working with someone on the outside? Had he orchestrated Riaz's death from within the prison? Or was there someone else entirely, someone who shared his cause, or his rage? Theories flooded the media. Some believed Afaq was the leader of a secret group targeting corrupt officials. Others believed it was an elaborate copycat killing meant to keep the public afraid. But none of the theories could explain the most unsettling part. How did the killer know exactly how Riaz had tortured others in the past? The details were too specific, too personal. It was as if someone had watched, waited, and struck when the time was right. The prison warden, disturbed by the events, ordered Afaq's cell to be searched. Everything was turned upside down. Books were opened, walls tapped, bedding stripped. They found nothing, no notes, no weapons, no connections. Just one thing stuck out. A folded piece of paper tucked into the spine of a book, hidden but not buried. It held only a single sentence. One flame doesn't end the night. That note became infamous. It was printed in newspapers, quoted in debates, and painted on protest banners. And though the case was technically closed, the fear it left behind never truly faded. Because deep down, everyone knew the truth. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning.